Hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast. My name is Christine Dorsey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association, and I'm your webcast moderator. Today is Thursday, June 5th, and we will hear multimodal transportation impact studies. For technical help during today's webcast, you can type your questions in the Q&A box. I'll do my best to answer those. For content questions related to the presentation, again, just type those in the Q&A box, and we will get to those at the end of the presentations during our designated Q&A. I will ask that if your question is for a particular panelist, that you state that within your question. It just helps me filter through and get questions to the right folks. Up on your screen is a list of our sponsoring APA chapters and divisions for 2025. Thanks to all those participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible and free to members. Today, we are sponsored by a joint collaboration between the APA Private Practice Division and the APA Transportation Planning Division. So thanks to both of you for coming together and bringing us this session. Coming up on your screen is a list of our upcoming sessions that we have available for you to register for. There are actually more than this up on our website. This is just through July. You can register for these and all of our upcoming sessions at ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. Today's session is worth 1.5 AICP CM credits. So if you are in need of those AICP credits, just head over to planning.org, log into your My APA account, and from there you can search by today's title or event number to log those credits. And the title and event number both can be found again on our website, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. If you're on social media, be sure to like us on Facebook. That's where I post any important date or time changes, when new sessions become available for you to register for, and a weekly reminder of what's on tap. We record all of our sessions and we post them to our YouTube channel. So you can visit YouTube/planningwebcast. Will pop up along with our well over 500 session recordings, all available to you for free. So be sure to subscribe to our channel so that you get notified when a new session has been uploaded for you to view. Last thing, we have an email listserv. I send an email out once a month reminding you of what sessions are available for you to register for. You can click the QR code or take a picture of that QR code, or again, just head over to our website to sign up for this mailing list. Again, I promise I only send you one email a month at the top of each month. So again, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast up at the top. You can join our email list. So that's the end of my housekeeping items. Again, if you have questions for our panelists, type those in the Q&A box. We'll get to those at the end of the Q&A. With that, I am going to stop sharing my screen. And Brad, I am going to be kicking it over to you, sir.
Great. Thanks, Christine. And actually, Dan Hardy's going to bring up the first set of slides, but I'll be doing the intro. So again, I'm Brad Strader. I'm co-chair of the Private Practice Division, PPD. And as Christine said, we're one of the co-sponsors along with Transportation Division. And just a little blurb about the Private Practice Division. We're a pretty active division. We really enjoy working with the Transportation Planning Division. We typically co-host a reception each year at the National Conference. Next year's conference is in Detroit, which is where I'm from. We're working hard on walking tours, transportation-focused walking and transit tours for the mobile workshops in Detroit, and also other mobile workshops affiliated with the conference. So I'm really hoping you come to Detroit next year and you can enjoy the reception that I assume that the Private Practice Division and the Transportation Planning Division will host again with the Women in Transportation Division here in Michigan. So private practice, if you are a member, you have access to our consultant handbook. I was one of the co-authors actually for that. We have every third Friday, typically at 3 o'clock Eastern time, we have a conversation where we bring in people to talk about specific topics, growing a transportation planning firm or a private practice firm, or managing, or hot topics of the day. So encourage you to join us on a Friday, 3 o'clock Eastern time afternoon conversation, or get affiliated in volunteering with the Private Practice Division. I'm going to turn it over to Phil, who's going to talk a little bit about the Transportation Planning Division. You're still muted, Phil.
Unmute. Here we go. Okay. I'm Philip Plotch. I'm the principal researcher at the Eno Center for Transportation and the vice chair of policy for the Transportation Planning Division. And we are delighted to have co-sponsored today's discussion. Our division is the largest in the APA. It's about 3,600 members. And we don't steer away from any sensitive topics. In fact, we're getting ready to kick off a webinar series about transportation and equity. Last year, we started a new transportation planning book club. I invite you all to join. We've had 3 different authors join our meetings recently, which is great. The authors of When Driving is Not an Option, the author of Killed by a Traffic Engineer, and the author of Inclusive Transportation. My email's here, and here's our website, and feel free to contact us. Thanks.
So again, just Brad Strader. I'm co-chair of the PPD, and I was also pretty involved with Dan Hardy, who will be our first speaker with ITE. I'm a former chair of the ITE Transportation Planning Council, as was Dan, and very involved in trying to kind of solidify the work of planners and traffic engineers so we can work in tandem and so forth. So pleased to help assemble the panel. And again, thanks to Philip Plock from the Transportation Planning Division for helping organize this session and finding the speakers. So let me just do a quick intro of the speakers. Our first speaker is Dan Hardy. Dan Hardy actually got me involved in ITE in 2006 or something back in Pittsburgh when he was the chair of the Planning Council, and I've worked with Dan on several ITE committees. Dan was the chair of the ITE's recommended practice on multimodal transportation impact analysis for site development. Engineers always use a lot of terminology, right? But Dan previously worked for Montgomery County, Maryland, which is just north of Washington, D.C., and he now works part-time with Renaissance Planning, and he's very involved in ITE and safety and so forth. And he's going to touch on kind of the background of updating the practice, all the things that are in the recommended practice. And at the end of the recommended practice, it talks about some emerging techniques and technologies, which our third speaker will talk about today. Our second speaker is Melissa Hayes from the City of Nashville, Tennessee. And Melissa organized. So Melissa reached out to other communities like Austin, Texas, and San Jose and so forth, to Washington, D.C., to find out who is kind of the best practice leaders in terms of communities and agencies, and also looked at the ITE handbook as a guide and put together a very incredible guidebook of multimodal transportation impact studies in Nashville instead of just traffic impact studies. And she's going to be talking about that. And I thought really interesting is, as they put it together, kind of testing out what the engineers who put this together, or the consultants and the developers, their reaction to going from a traffic impact study process to a multimodal transportation impact process. And then our third speaker is Philip from Riverside, California. So at the end of Dan's book, or ITE's handbook on recommended practices, it talks about emerging technologies like pro rata share, other things, safety and so forth. And one of the ideas was a conversion from level of service to vehicle miles of travel, VMT. So Philip and Riverside have just gone through a process to follow the changes of state law, go from a traffic impact study level of service analysis to VMT, and sort of the pros and cons of going through that. So Phil will be our final speaker talking about the VMT process. So with that, again, thanks to all 3 speakers, and turn it over to Dan as our kickoff. Oh, and Dan, you're muted also.
I know, that's why I thought I was going to be so smooth, but had to let everybody see me unmute. Let's go back here. Am I still sharing my screen? Yes, I am. All right, I think we're all set. So thanks, Brad, for the introduction. Thanks to all of you in the audience for being here today and sharing information about multimodal transportation impact analyses. I'm going to talk just for a little bit to kind of set the stage about, as Brad said, where ITE has been in developing and now kind of curating the 2023 recommended practice on multimodal transportation impact analysis for site development. And yes, we love our acronyms. And so This publication is now 2 years old. It's about the fourth in a series of updates. The last one prior to this was 2010. So a lot has changed and a lot has stayed the same. So I'm going to kind of highlight those. Well, what did we evolve and where are we headed next? And the three bullets at the bottom of this slide are kind of a theme that there's tons of information in here, as I'm sure you all would expect. And there were kind of three sort of tensions that kind of came through the development process, which for those of you who don't know IT recommended practices, it is a peer-reviewed document. They typically take about a year to kind of develop with a committee, a set of recommendations, and then a couple of years of peer review and balloting. I think we had something on the order of 1,000 comments to respond to, and either change something or explain why we didn't change it. And then the ITE board actually approves a recommended practice. So there's, what's recommended, what's emerging, and that was a really, you'll hear that, and that's why this webinar is so great, because we're going to kind of talk about both of those elements. So at the three speakers today, a little bit of aspirations versus nexus, and this is, I think, a challenge everybody faces. We all see all these problems we'd love to have corrected. Land development's an opportunity to correct them, but what's the actual balance of what's fair for a developer to contribute? Because all implementing master plans is all a mix of public and private investment. And then lastly, the prior editions of this document, which all have been about 120, 130 pages, by the way, they've all been really driven towards the practitioner. It's a guide for the best practices for how to, but given all the emerging tools and practices, we added a new chapter that will really kind of helps present this more from a policymaker perspective. So the audience changed just a little bit for this document, and I'll cover that at the end of the presentation. So lots of acronyms, and Brad even highlighted this in the introductions. A lot of jurisdictions still say we do TISs, and what's in a name? It's a little. This is mostly symbolic, but hey, you manage what you measure, all that kind of good stuff. So we kind of evolved from the TIS through the 2010 version was the fourth bullet, the TIASD. Now we're at the MTIA or the MTIASD, and so this is partly just an excuse for me if I use any of these acronyms by my alone. They're all kind of meaning the same thing. But the second thing is that kind of tension between what's ready to be recommended and what's still in the process of being worked through. And so a lot of the things you're going to hear, particularly regarding safety, regarding bicycle and how you measure bicycle comfort, quality, service, and VMT. All of these three things are things that are somewhere in that promising leading practice, but we felt not quite ready yet to be in the best practice. But we now are in that process. Okay, it's been a couple of years. What do we now need to start thinking about the next evolution? So what I'll talk about is, again, many of you probably familiar with the recommended practice. Oh, another acronym, the RP, and maybe have maybe you already have a copy. I think Christine will drop a link to the ITE bookstore for those who don't. How did we help advance the industry? And again, this is just a picture here, one of my favorite pictures. Just trying to think multimodally. That was another element that we didn't have any tension about. Everybody wanted to think multimodally. How do we do that? And thinking about how particularly modes interact, or in some cases don't. Then what's really new, what's a little bit different, and then what's next, which is kind of where we are now. So again, what prompted us to update the MTIA, or for ITE to update the MTA after about a decade? Continued shift, mostly kind of things that were already brewing, but just got accelerated. And I should mention that the initiative to start this RP started in about 2018. So it took about 5 years from, is that too old in our RP? Should we update that? To, yeah, we should. And who wants to be involved? And let's go through drafts and go through the balloting and everything. So, that shift from greenfields to infill accelerated. We've got a lot more data. Big data is really helpful to understand traveler behavior and get that built into what are we trying to implement. Generally interest in, for almost all corners saying, not that level of service is dead, but we got to make sure we're doing something other than just traditional auto level of service. And then fair share concerns. And again, many of you are probably familiar with these kind of terms of free rider. 10 developers come in, the road's been built by the public, they don't have to do anything. The 11th guy comes in as the straw that breaks the camel's back and is caught with a lot of mitigation work. So those things all were things we were trying to tackle. In terms of what are we trying to build? And again, master plans get implemented by both public and private sector. We wanted to kind of just emphasize the goal of linking, what your jurisdictions' overall objectives are with what you're measuring and exacting when you do land development. And I just love this picture too from Florence, Oregon, on the Pacific Coast Highway. So of course they've got a brand that features the Pacific Coast Highway, but none of those 5 objectives for the city say we want you to drive fast on the Pacific Coast Highway through town. They'd much rather have you be going slowly and stopping and buying something while you're in town. So we and Philip might get to this, but the whole VMT thing. If you care about congestion, make sure that's your plan says that. So the kind of legislative authority and rational nexus bullets there at the bottom of the slide are kind of some of those things of just the tensions of, okay, we know, even if we know what we want, what's the fair share for the private sector to be providing? A very boring slide. You probably can't even read the flow chart, but basically there is still a case that just like the 4-step process, it's on the slide there somewhere. There's still a lot of things that are essentially the same. Got to know what the existing conditions are. Got to know what the other developments are. Got to figure out some way to grow things and assess things against standards. So most of the probably of the 120 or so pages, probably 80 pages didn't change at all because it's just basically a good process for looking at site development one case at a time. And the chapters, there's 10 basic chapters that the names changed a little bit. I think we added the Q in front of the Q, LOS analysis perhaps. But by and large, those 10 chapters are still per that detailed flow chart, the right way to kind of proceed through. I'm going to talk about chapter 11 in one of my last slides. That was where we sort of said we got to be thinking ahead towards the next iteration of policy changes. So what are some of the things that were new? Really an emphasis on switching from thinking about vehicles to thinking about people. And it's true that in many jurisdictions, there's not really a difference between the two if you're in a rural area, but in almost every other jurisdiction besides the most rural, there's at least auto passengers and many more of them than people tend to think of because we think about journey to work and not just all vehicles. So the idea of saying, even if you're not doing TDM to try to reduce vehicle trips in a certain case, be thinking about who those customers to your site are, employees included, and how they're going to get there. So the next topic is sort of on safety. This is one of the places we did beef up things a lot. Federal Highway had just released some data-driven safety analysis related to looking at private sector development. This image is actually from that the document, and so there's a bunch of good kind of think about your state highway safety plan. If you're in the United States, for instance, think about different resources for identifying safety needs that the private sector could help with. And then, as you're looking at mitigation, this example is, don't just think about, do I solve my traffic congestion problem, which is what still most jurisdictions are measuring, but think about, am I doing the thing that helps safety the most? Should there be more? This is one of the topics that is really kind of challenging for the industry because safety is important to everybody. But one of the debates we resolved, but I think we'll resume again, is when a new development adds traffic to the system, and even if the safety stays the same, there's more crashes. Is the new development responsible for those crashes? And we in the recommended practice said no, because they're not making the conditions any worse. But I think that's an open discussion that we'll have over the next many months. So some subtle differences. I won't spend much time on this, but like for instance, Vision Zero, this document might last 10 years. We will hopefully still be doing something like Vision Zero. We might just not be calling it Vision Zero at that point. So there are a lot of these things. Color graphics, Brad's old firm there, we get to thank for some of the advanced graphics in the document. And then lastly, kind of this chapter 11, what are the 3 areas where we said, this is a really big topic and a big deal. We need more industry kind of exploration of these topics, which again, this webinar is going to turn over to now with both Melissa and Philip in terms of just thinking about how do we use the design of the site itself and help reduce vehicle traffic and make it better for other modes. Pro rata share districts, basically the picture up there of Baltimore of saying do essentially a mega transportation impact study for a 300 or 400 acre development site, and then have it be sort of a pay and go, if that makes sense. That once development gets charged for what the public sector has to build in that area. And again, Philip will talk a lot about VMT as a TIA metric. So very last thing here, training materials. Just wanted to mention that there are a couple of training courses available from ITE. There's a basic course that's actually just wrapped up for the spring, and the fall sessions haven't been announced, but it's a combination 3 group sessions and some independent study for, I think, 12 PDHs. And right now, in the beginning of June, there's an advanced course. It's in its first iteration right now. And I think they're going to plan to offer that once a year, but they'll see how this goes. And today, great, we're going to hear 2 great examples, case studies from Melissa and Philip, and we want to hear more. So if please get in touch with me or any of our speakers if you say, hey, I think I'd like to share something that our jurisdiction has done. We think it's pretty cool. That's what we really are in the process from an ITE perspective now, of sharing information and trying to just start thinking about the next generation of what should the next recommended practice be, what will move from emerging to promising to recommended. And so that's it for me. I think at this point I get to stop sharing so that Melissa can share her screen, and I'll look forward to returning when we get to Q&A.
All right, thank you, Dan, for passing it off. Let me find my screen I'm sharing. There we go. Okay. Looks like it's loading. 1 sec. There we go. All right, thank you everyone for being here today and for this opportunity to present to you all about what we've done in Nashville. And the presentation today will kind of go along with what Dan was talking about. So excited to share a case study about this. So I'm going to talk to you about today in Nashville, we updated our traffic impact study guideline to incorporate multimodal and safety analyses into the overall studies that we receive from developments. So I'll talk about why we wanted to update the guideline, our overview of the project, the execution, and our current next steps, which are receiving feedback from the traffic engineer firms who complete the studies, and potential revisions that we're considering to do to the guideline. So as a little overview, NDOT, Nashville Department of Transportation, we want to build and manage a safe, reliable public transportation network to elevate the quality of life and prosperity in our county. And we did adopt a Vision Zero action plan in 2022 with these 5 main strategies to improve safety for all road users. We want to prioritize safety improvements, update design standards, create policy, reduce speeds, and integrate pedestrian scale lighting. So that ties into this, how the development with their impacts can participate in improving the safety of the city. So what is a traffic impact study? I'm sure you're all pretty familiar, but if not, there's a scoping process that's involved of the brief and high level view of what the development is itself, the trip generation, what study intersections they'll be looking at, and then they'll go on to complete the study, which used to, for us, just include the vehicle level of traffic, the level of service, the LOS analyses, Q analysis, signal warrant analyses when they were applicable to the scenarios, and the lane warrant analyses also if applicable. And then they would then recommend their mitigation measures. So challenges that we had with this, one which isn't listed on this slide specifically, but Nashville cannot legally require any kind of impact fees. So all of the development impact mitigations had to be done and recommended through the studies. With the study just looking at vehicle analysis, we were having trouble getting any kind of safety improvements or even knowing if there's existing safety issues. We didn't really have a holistic view of what was going on with pedestrians, bicyclists, and transit users. So that was a big issue that we had that prompted this update. The previous guideline that we had was created and last updated in 2004. So a lot had changed between 2004 and 2023, which was when we released our new manual. There was also a major code update that occurred in 2017 that changed requirements for the traffic impact study. So now the code wasn't aligning with what our guide had said before. And because of all of these things, we had delayed decision making, inconsistent outcomes between different developments of similar scale and what they were actually doing for their mitigations. So we needed to have a major upgrade. So our goals of this project were to emphasize multimodal mobility and safety. We wanted to align with all of our city's policies and plans. We wanted to make this document an innovative and new best practice led document, make sure that all the studies we were receiving going forward really had a holistic view and comprehensive assessment of the entire transportation network within their study area. So this also kind of ties into what Dan was talking about with the titles. We wanted to emphasize the multimodal aspect of the study, so we decided to update the title of our traffic impact studies to Multimodal Transportation Analyses, or MMTA for short. So key activities that we did during this process included a best practice review and peer city analysis. We looked at our existing conditions in Nashville, a policy assessment. We updated the Metro Code, and we prepared the guideline itself, of course. As a brief summary of our best practice review, we emphasized research on multimodal and safety analyses. We had to take into account, like I said before, the difference between impact fees versus a rational nexus for mitigations. That was a big challenge when we were looking at peer cities, because a lot of cities use impact fees, which we cannot do here. And then existing conditions, we wanted to make sure we involved lots of stakeholders, both internal to the government and external with the different local organizations, engineering firms, developers, council members, etc. And a summary of our code update, we just wanted to make sure the code specifically talked about multimodal and safety analyses that were added. We added some timeline definitions of when developers could expect NDOT to review their studies. That was some of the feedback we had received from them. We added some clarifications and explanations. So as just to come back to this slide, this is what our traffic impact studies used to look like. And this is what we've added in bold. So we added a high-level multimodal review to the scoping process. We added pedestrian, bicycle, transit, and safety analyses to the analysis portion of the study. And then we also added some additional things to the recommendations section. We added a community needs portion that briefly went over the median household income, like kind of the characteristics of the study areas tracked. It's unfortunately omitted right now because the GIS tool by USDOT is currently down. So hopefully that comes back up soon, because I do feel like some of that information was kind of helpful to determining what the mitigation measures were that the development implemented. So I only had brief time to talk through this. So this is a very quick and high level summary of what is in these analyses. So for the pedestrian bicycle analysis sections, we looked at a level of traffic stress instead of a level of service. We had a lot of reasons for this, but mainly we didn't want our level of service of pedestrians to show that there were barely any pedestrians in the network. If they took pedestrian counts, usually they're not super high. So depending on the area, of course, if you're in the downtown, there'll be a lot of counts, but in other urban areas, they might be pretty low. So we decided to go with a level of traffic stress, which focuses mainly on the facilities themselves and the conditions of the roadway. The studies would show a map similar to this. So the next few slides of these examples show just an example of a development, which is the hashed rectangle, and the study intersections and study segments in between each intersection that they would have looked at. So the numbers are just the study intersection number. The colors are what corresponds to the level of traffic stress. So 1 in green is good, red is bad and unsafe, not suitable for children or wheeled mobility device users. Bicycle level traffic stress is very similar to the pedestrian one. So I included an image of one of our flow charts that's in the appendix. We have flow charts for both pedestrian and bicycle level of traffic stress, and there are multiple for each one. This one in particular is based on the speed limit. but we also have flowcharts based on the widths of the facility, if there's any buffer, if there's a physical buffer, if it's just striping, the speed limit, which is shown here, and so on and so forth. Transit and access, we look at, it's a combination of the pedestrian level of traffic stress and the existing facilities as well. And one thing that we've added, shown on this screen, is the anticipated and most likely pedestrian path to the nearest transit stops. So this was added and really helps draw the nexus of the development and their impacts to the system. So if they take multimodal reductions, obviously they're going to have some transit users. So this will show if there's any deficiencies along these pedestrian paths, if there's a lot of crashes at the intersection, they have to cross. There's anything needed beyond just if there's a bench at the transit stop, if that makes sense. This draws that conclusion and really shows what the development's impact is and what their the developers, like if it's a multimodal, or if it's a if it's a residential development and they're using transit, there'll be a clear path of where we need to have them do improvements at. And then as a brief summary of the safety analysis section, there's a lot more than just what's shown on this slide again, but we have them look at the past 5-year crash history of the study intersection and break it down into several different things: the severity, the time of day, if it's clear lighted outside. We have pedestrian crash maps that they would show, so specifically pulling out just a map of the pedestrian crashes. If you remember, this intersection here was where pedestrians would be crossing to get to the transit stop. So all of this is to tie together what the development needs to do and how it connects to the development itself. So that leads us to the improvement section. One of the issues we used to have with the traffic impact studies were they would do the analysis and only show what the development was doing. Sometimes in the analysis, you would see there's maybe 10 issues out there, but maybe it's not rational to make the development do all 10 of them. So there was kind of this lack of information of, we saw through the analysis there was an issue, but then they're not talking about it at all in the recommendation section. So we wanted to improve that by showing all of the deficiencies improvements, but then showing in another chart what from those that the development is actually doing. So that way everything is fully covered. Because sometimes people from the public might request one of these studies to just review for whatever reason. And we would get lots of questions about why certain things weren't talked about in the recommendation section. So that kind of ties that up there. The rational nexus is a difficult thing. It's kind of based on engineering judgment and what is drawn from the study. So mode splits that were applied, any reductions, parking that's provided, the analyses themselves, safety concerns, plan compliance. There's no equation for what the rational nexus should be. So we kind of just have to draw conclusions. Sometimes negotiations are involved. Yeah. So I'll try to, I didn't time myself. I'm not sure where I'm at on time, but quickly, we did just send out a progress form to the traffic engineers who complete the studies, just to see where they're at and how everything's been going. They hadn't offered up information on their own until we sent this out. So some of this was very interesting to see. Stakeholder engagement throughout our process of developing the study. This shows that everyone who did the form, they attended at least. Some didn't share any feedback, some did. Their time to implement the new guideline and update their templates took around a month to 2 to 3 months. Their increased time on the scoping form ranged between 1 hour and 3 hours. Majority was 1 hour though. Increased time on the studies themselves majority of them was about 15 to 20 hours added to as previously with the traffic impact study. And then we have some satisfaction bars here. The traffic engineers' satisfaction with the guideline, majority are satisfied. There were some who were somewhat dissatisfied. Client satisfaction, not very surprising. They weren't very satisfied with the added work that had to be done. The interesting thing to me with this was I asked a question about if there was an improved nexus between the development impacts and the recommendations that came out of the study. And majority of the traffic engineers said there still was an unclear nexus. So that leads us to next steps and what to take from this. The summary of majority what people were saying was that they're reviewing the existing conditions and basing mitigations on the needs of the study area. So there's still that lack of connection between the development and the mitigation measures, unfortunately. There's concerns with getting existing multimodal counts, like I said, low numbers, LOS may not be the best route. Existing and non-existing facilities, which is what our level of traffic stress analyses are based on, may not necessarily be the development's responsibility to improve. So that's kind of the issue that we're facing now. Oops. And then mode split. So we have them apply a mode split to their trip generation based on the area it's in, the type of development it may be. But again, there's no science to this really. It's just based on engineering judgment and what we come to for the most part. So improvement ideas based on the feedback and just from feedback from my own staff that I work with on these studies, we need to do something about the mode split and make it a little more precise and consistent. It would be a really large undertaking and task. So I'm not sure when we'll be able to take this on, but we'll definitely be, it's been on the top of our conversations. So we're hoping to get something like that started. Another thing that may be a little simpler to do is to revisit our multimodal analysis section, maybe simplify the existing condition review and try to have more expansion on the pedestrian bike paths to maybe major or nearby destinations like the transit review does. So that is kind of where we're headed. Lessons learned with this project, continuously engaging stakeholders. Like I said before, I went over their feedback. I hadn't been told any of this before we sent out this feedback form. So it's important to engage because we wouldn't have known that they still think the nexus isn't being clear. Transparency is really key. We tried to include the stakeholders throughout the entire process, and still we want to make sure that everyone's on the same page and everyone's happy as they could be. Guidance on how we want analysis to be represented. Also, we try to be really thorough with that in the guideline itself. And project goals evolve over time. So that was it. There was a lot of information, but the QR code leads to the project webpage. Our guideline itself is on that webpage. Supporting documents are on that page. Our whole process, the Peer City review, everything is on there. So if you're interested, check it out. And feel free to email me any questions if we don't have time to get to them later. Really appreciate the time, and I will pass it off to our next presenter. Once I figure out how to stop sharing. Okay, there we go. All right, thank you.
All right. Can somebody confirm that they could see my screen?
Yes, you're good to go.
All right, great. Thank you all. Just some housekeeping items. My name is Philip Nituyama. I'm the city traffic engineer for the city of Riverside. I'm going to provide a presentation about the city of Riverside's vehicle miles traveled mitigation bank pilot program. It's not a multimodal transportation analysis in that same sense. However, at the tail end of the VMT mitigation, there are improvements for biking and pedestrian safety and multimodal transportation. So it's not the same analysis, but we get to the same destination. Just a quick overview of the city of Riverside. We're a very progressive city, very large. We have over 300,000 residents and about over 80,000, or I'm sorry, 80 square miles. Some parts of the city is urban, some parts are rural, some parts are suburban. We're the 12th largest city in California. We're the largest city in Riverside County. Our city is broken down into 7 wards, so we have 7 council members to appease. We are a full service city, and we do a lot of the work in-house. This slide just shows a quick graphical representation. We're located in the Southern California area. The city is not shaped like a heart. It's just a photo on the top left. But the city is broken down with 2 main freeways that cuts right through the middle of the city. So it is a bit divided because of those freeways. We do have, I believe, 3 colleges and a resort called Mission Inn in the city. So I'm going to start off with a landmark law called Senate Bill 743. This law was passed in 2013, so it's not new. We've been talking about it for a while, but it was implemented on July 1, 2020. So we had to transition from your traditional level of service automobile delay to vehicle miles traveled. And that's for every local jurisdiction in California, not just the city of Riverside. The main goal of 743 and VMT is to eliminate a single occupant driver in a vehicle. That promotes walking, biking, transit, or a carpool, multiple people in the car. That transition occurred on June 16, 2020. That was our first phase for the city. We had to be compliant with the state, so that's when we transitioned. Now we're on step 2. We're trying to mitigate impacts when you have VMT as the transportation metric. So this is a graphical representation of the difference between the two. Most people and practitioners in the transportation industry utilize level of service, where you measure delay at an intersection, and then you have your level of service, A to F. What vehicle miles traveled does is it focuses on the trip, the beginning and the ending of the trip, and the trip mode. So how do you measure VMT? Let's say, for example, you have 4 vehicles that travel 30 miles, 4 times 30, that's 120 VMT. What we're trying to accomplish is lessen the number of cars on the roads, shorten the trip. So there's a land use factor in there as well. The common question I'm asked, did we completely eliminate level of service? The answer is no. The state requires VMT, but the city, as part of our general plan, we still have level of service incorporated. So fortunately for us, but unfortunately for the developers, they're required to review 2 traffic studies, one for VMT, one for level of service. So as Dan was alluding to earlier, there's a TIA, and then there's a multimodal transportation or transportation analysis, which is VMT for us. So fast forward to 2020, under our Western Riverside Council of Governments, we're very lucky. They provided us with a screening tool to transition from level of service to VMT and be compliant with the state requirements and guidelines. they created a tool online to screen a project from VMT analysis, just exemption only. There are 5 that are listed here. These are the most common that are used. If you're within a half mile of a Metrolink station or a transit station, you're exempt from VMT. If you're in a predefined low VMT area, your project is exempt. There are certain project types and mixed-use projects and redevelopment projects that are exempt from doing analysis altogether. And this is just a graphical representation of that tool that our WR-COG provided us with. Just based on geographical location, there are certain developments that are exempt from VMT. So they don't even have to do a study if they're physically located in these locations. One of the exemptions is high frequency bus service. If your service interval or headway in a bus route is 20 minutes or less, that's considered a high priority transit corridor and they're exempt from VMT. So that's what the COG provided us with, a screening tool. So that really helped us transition and be compliant with the state requirements. So we've been compliant, I guess, or we've transitioned since July 2020. It's now 2025. We've had about 5 years of doing this. What are the results? So based on that screening criteria that we established, we were able to exempt 90% of development applications. So I wanted to indicate that the city of Riverside is a developing city. So we receive up to 175 development applications per year. And that ranges from, a liquor license, as simple as that, all the way up to we're trying to build 350 single family development units. So of those 175, 90% are exempt from VMT analysis. And the criteria we've utilized the most, one of the exemptions is called local serving project, which is if the project is 50,000 square feet of retail or less, it's exempt from VMT analysis. So the problem is the remaining 10%. How do you mitigate that 10% if they have a VMT impact? So there is a CAPCOA handbook. And this handbook is available online. There's a 2024 version. This handbook is used a lot by practitioners. It provides a lot of VMT mitigation. And this is just available for California, but anyone can use it. This handbook provides reductions in VMT, but they're very small and they're in percentages. Some of the key mitigation is bike facilities. If you build a bike rack, if you have a bike locker or bike showers at your facility, there's a certain percentage of VMT that you're reducing. Pedestrian networks, such as constructing sidewalks adjacent to your project, that's a VMT reducing project. And then you can also subsidize bus passes, increase land use density, or unbundle parking costs, or basically discourage using a vehicle. So those are some of the improvements on here. What we've found is that those mitigation improvements are usually not enough to offset your impact. So what are the options for a developer if they can't offset their impact? Usually they have to go through an environmental process, either a full-blown environmental process or a mitigated negative declaration. As everyone knows, the environmental process takes a lot of time. It's based on approval of a discretionary board. It's very costly. So those are the things that we've learned so far. The other thing is that each agency has a different approach to VMT reduction. So that varies per agency, and I have a slide that's going to show that. So after all that was the background. So this is the solution now. We're trying to create our own VMT mitigation bank. We do have a website. riversidevmt.com, that walks through that process. It took us about 18 months to complete it. If successful, right now it's a pilot project. We hope to make it permanent. With the VMT bank, we're trying to make the process easier for developers so that they could review their project right up front, determine if they're exempt. That's the existing tool. But if they're not exempt, this tool that we have will be able to mitigate your impact. So that's the next step that we're trying to accomplish. There's just a quick overview of our process. We did have a comprehensive community engagement. We went through 4 public meetings through our boards to approve. We went through the Transportation Board, the Planning Commission, the Land Use Committee, and then ultimately City Council. All of them approved it unanimously, with the exception of one board member in our transportation board who did not believe in VMT altogether, even though it was a state mandate. We did work with our stakeholders, as shown on the right, the COG for our community and our county of Riverside, and then Riverside Transit Agency. They're the ones that control the transit buses in the city, and so they had a big hand in helping us get this through and processed. One item I wanted to highlight, we had a developers only meeting. So this was unique because we invited the top, I think, 10 or 15 developers in the city. We showed them the VMT program and how much it would cost. And, they don't want to pay anything more. So they said, whatever we threw at them, they said, make it cheaper, make it free. We couldn't make it free, but we tried to really make it as cost effective as possible. So that developers only meeting really helped us really identify what we're trying to approve. So during the VMT mitigation analysis, we had several projects that we considered. Most of them were bikes, pedestrian sidewalk improvements. And then we talked to RTA, which is our transit operator, and we analyzed these, and we're trying to determine how much VMT we could reduce with these improvements. So that's what's shown here. On the bottom right, there are 3 main mitigation programs. We ended up with the bank, and I'll explain that in later slides. The other slides that we considered are number 2, impact fees. Impact fees everyone would pay, right? And even though you don't have a VMT impact, you would pay. So the developers only meeting told us that they didn't like that. A VMT exchange, that means that they're paying for the whole project. So for example, if you have to stripe a bike lane for an entire corridor, they have to pay for the whole project, whether that exceeds their VMT impact or not. So that was we thought that really didn't make sense. So we ended up with a bank, which is a unit VMT reduction fee, and the city would implement the improvement. We are a full service city, so we're very comfortable designing and building the project. This is just an example of a development and how we analyze VMT. So on the far left, we're going to start with the initial project analysis. We have a VMT threshold, so everything under green is okay. When you're above the threshold level, so that's the red part, you have a VMT impact. If you go to the middle, there's project-specific VMT reducing items that you could do on site. So these are on the site of the project. It could be sidewalks, it could be bike racks, bike lockers, it could be subsidizing bus passes or having a transportation coordinator. The one on the far right is what we are providing as a resource for a local agency. It's offsite mitigation. So you could mitigate fully if you still have an impact. So this is just a conceptual view. Where did we get our projects, our improvement projects from? This is our bike master plan. As you can see, the solid lines are completed bikeways. The dashed lines are not completed, but they are in our bike master plan. So we used the bike master plan to determine some VMT reducing projects. So we didn't just pick them out of the blue. There is a rhyme and reason for them. All right, so this is our package for VMT mitigation. Option A, and this is what was adopted and what was approved. We took those 29 bike projects, we analyzed about half of them, 14 of them. And this is the roadway and the type of bike. For each one, we determined a construction cost. And then we determined how much VMT would this reduce if this bike infrastructure or bike lane was constructed. I get a lot of questions about how the VMT reduced column was determined. There is a document called NCHRP 552 that determines future ridership. And we also utilize big data from Replica to assume and determine, have some assumptions of how much VMT is reduced. And this is a daily VMT, so it's number of vehicles times the by length. So that column assumes how much you're reducing your VMT, and then the far right is your cost per VMT. So we did that for each of the 14 projects. And then if you visualize summing those all up, at the very bottom, there's a total cost to construct all of these bike improvements. There's a total VMT it's going to be reduced. Then you get that final number on the bottom right, $98 per unit VMT reduced. So that's how we got that number. One thing we kept in mind was the developer said, keep it as cheap as and cost effective as possible. So we eliminated some of the costlier projects. So our VMT reduced unit costs were below 2,000 is what we were trying to achieve. The other innovative thing that I'm going to mention really quickly, 12 of these projects are partially funded by our Safe Streets for All implementation grant. So some of these costs are extremely low. You're only seeing the 20%. Our SS4A grant is paying 80% of those costs. So that's how we were able to reduce the cost of the bike construction. This is just a visual exhibit of all the buses in the city of Riverside. As you can see, the Magnolia Market Corridor has a lot of buses, and that's how it was minimized our headway to less than 20 minutes. So that's why that middle of the city is a VMT reducing geographic area. So this is an option B for our VMT mitigation package. We didn't approve this, but it was an alternative that we considered. In addition to the bike improvements, there were bus improvements. So on the bottom half of this slide, you could see that adding bus service cost roughly $5.9 million. It reduced a ton of VMT, but the cost to reduce per VMT increased exponentially. And so this option was not approved because it was very expensive, and the developers were not in favor of it. Option C, we added 2 sidewalks as part of our package, and that's the bottom 2 items on there. The cost to add sidewalk over a long stretch was pretty significant. It was around $1 million. The reduction in VMT for sidewalks was very small. So you can see on the bottom right, the cost per VMT for sidewalk was extremely high. I think at that point, the developer would consider doing a full-blown environmental impact report instead of doing a VMT project. And then when you average out, option C was the highest VMT cost, so we didn't approve this option. We did a quick screen check with other local agencies in the state of California to see what they were doing in regards to VMT. mitigation. We did find a handful of agencies that also had a mitigation impact program. As you can see on the far right, their unit VMT costs were shown there. They're significantly higher, with the exception of Lancaster. They had a subsidized VMT mitigation program where their city paid for half of the mitigation. So the city of Riverside, we were on the forefront of VMT mitigation that we were aware of. Our program is $98 per VMT reduced, which is the best one statewide that we're aware of. So in addition to the VMT program, we created a VMT tool online. It's called Treadlight. That's called Trip Reduction Environmental Dashboard. This tool is available on our website, riversidevmt.com. Very simple to use if you're a traffic impact practitioner. You can input your location, you input the number of dwelling units, you input the single family as the proposed project, and the tool spits out a report right away. Does it have an impact or not? If there's no impact, you're done. It's exempt from analysis. If you do have an impact, there's an option to mitigate using our VMT bank. I did a quick analysis in the bottom right. You can see a project has an impact. You multiply it by the number of houses, and then you multiply it by our general plan housing element assumption of 3.26 persons per household, and that provides you with your VMT, and then you multiply it by your VMT cost. And so that's how we got that. And this can all be done within about 10 minutes with very, very easy inputs. So just in closing, this is a quick example of a project, Adauchi and Ferrari. They had a VMT impact of 3.2 VMT. So to mitigate it, you take your 3.2 VMT impact, you times it by $98 per VMT reduced, times it by 53 dwelling units, times it by 3.26 people per home, and that's the total cost to mitigate their VMT impact if they didn't do anything. That saved the impact of the project from doing environmental studies, and it also provided the developer with a specific number that they need to mitigate. The developer ended up proposing pedestrian improvements on site as well, so that reduced the VMT impact even more. But this is just an example that I wanted to use, and this is our first project that had promised or had commitments to pay into the VMT bank. I was trying to look for a similar project, so nothing negative about this project. It's just this project was processed before our VMT bank was available. So Wood and Lauren, it's a bigger project. It had 96 dwelling units. They had to do an environmental impact analysis report. That report took over 15 months. I think total environmental studies, this is just an estimate, it was around 150,000. They used that CAPCOA handbook, but they still weren't able to fully mitigate their project, so they had impacts. So that's why they ended up with a full-blown EIR. So just comparing the two projects, there's a savings of time and also money once we have the VMT bank ready. That concludes my presentation. I'm available for any questions you may have. My contact information is shown there. On our website, riversidevmt.com, it does go through that process of how to use the VMT online tool with screening and mitigation. So thank you all for providing me with this opportunity to share our process. I'm going to hand it back over to our moderator, Christine. Thank you.
Yeah, Christine, while we wait for you to come back on, Philip, I guess I have a question for each speaker. Can concisely though. So I'm a planner. I work with Syncar Consulting in Detroit and in Atlanta, but work with other places. And sometimes our role working with cities and agencies through land use plans or comprehensive plans and zoning codes, but also occasionally working with the developers is to reduce VMT. And we have a lot of planners that are watching the webinar here today. How does the engineering department work with the planners, and how does Riverside try to reduce VMT through like master planning, zoning codes, and reviews, and working with developers to reduce the VMT before you have to mitigate?
Oh, that's a great question. So thank you for sharing that. We do work with our planning department very closely. All of the development applications go through them, and then it's handed over to us to review the transportation component. Right off the bat at the very beginning, we'll inform them if there's an impact in VMT or not, or even level of service. So they're aware of the process. We work with them whether they have to do an exemption environmentally or a mitigated negative deck or a full-blown environmental analysis. So we work hand in hand with them, and then they also provide us with the cumulative projects, obviously. We are doing a citywide general plan update right now. And as part of that general update, we're updating our land use element. So our land use element has certain pockets of high VMT areas. So if we can include those high VMT areas in our land use element updates, that will provide an additional exemption for those areas. So they don't even have to go through an environmental study because they're already included in the land use element update. So that's one exemption that we work with our planning department, and we also update. Our planning department helped us provide an ordinance to adopt the VMT. They walked me through. I did my own CEQA exemption or environmental exemption, and so we didn't have to hire a consultant to do that. We did it in-house. So those are just some examples of how we work together with our planning department for VMT mitigation and transportation impacts.
Great, thanks, Philip. Melissa, I have a question for you that kind of echoes a couple of the questions that came in online, but you mentioned in Nashville you can't use impact fees, and some of the states I work in also can't do impact fees. Other states have proffers or other things. So when you identify improvements that are needed through the multimodal transportation analysis, how do you convince the applicant or the developer to mitigate the problem? Is it based on rough proportionality, or is it just to get approval, they kind of volunteer to make improvements, or is the process to identify things that need to be done and you don't expect the developer to make any improvements?
So yeah, we also work with our planning department on this. They won't approve projects if they don't offset impacts. So we work hand in hand, they kind of got our back, we have their back, and that kind of thing. We with the There's a lot to your question, so if I miss anything, let me know. But we will so the studies luckily are done by the developer. They hire a traffic engineer, so the traffic engineers also kind of work with us and understand that we won't be approving projects if they're not offsetting their development impact. So the traffic engineers, from what they've told us, they try to tell the developers that they should be expecting certain mitigation measures that they're going to have to do. So everyone kind of works together to make the developers aware that they will be expected to make some sort of improvements to offset their development. A lot of times, larger developments that trigger the studies also have zoning changes attached to them, so that makes a higher expectation, basically, that since they're changing the land use, it used to be a single family house, they're putting like 20 multifamilies onto the one lot, or whatever the case may be. There's obvious impacts from that wouldn't have been allowed originally with the regular zoning. So there's a lot of things that kind of go into it. I read some of the comment too that ties into this. Sometimes we do get contributions. We can't call it an impact fee, but we basically negotiate with the developer and the traffic engineer they hire to come up with a number we can't have an equation to come up with a number because then it would be impact fee. So it's like there's a lot of negotiation that goes on, makes it challenging. Sometimes we deal with developers who don't want to pay anything or do anything. So it's a challenge, but yeah, luckily the traffic engineers, the external to Metro traffic engineers work with us. We work with the city planners who are approving these projects. We work with the council members. Everyone kind of comes together to try to get what we can out of the developers.
Great. Thanks, Melissa. And Dan, I have a two-part question for you. One is both Melissa and Philip talked about reaching out to the users to get feedback on their process and so forth and making some changes. So in terms of the new recommended practice, I know that IT has a working group that's looking at case studies and so forth and finding out how the practice is being used and or applied and what some lessons learned or some like information that can go back out to people that are using the recommended practice to say, here's some other things to think about. So what has been kind of the user experience, like what are 2 or 3 things you think that might be part of that like next step? And unrelated to that, but another question was, what about freight? And I know that the recommended practice also talks about freight impacts. If you could talk about that.
Yeah, sure. So actually, I love, Melissa, your examples of the feedback because I think that's, Brad, you're asking for a preview of the next 3 webinars, I think, right? But this working group we've been doing this for a couple of years now. I don't know that there's many people that have been as formal as what Nashville has done in terms of that kind of documenting things. But I think the feedback that both Melissa and Philip are getting are kind of similar, and a lot of it has to do with if you're in the developer's shoes, you're really looking for what's my cost and time equals money. And so that's, what I thought was really kind of fascinating was, most of the feedback is, we had problems. You listened to us. You solved our problems. Thank you. Oh, and then you added a whole bunch of new problems to us. And so the one thing I think I dropped an internal link there. If Christine maybe wants to put another link from our internal chat into the group chat, ITE has another way of getting information out called a quick bite. And with Montgomery County, one of the feedbacks they got, and this goes back a couple of years, was the same, the question about rough proportionality. Are we asking, when we pile all these great ideas on, are we asking for too much? And so one of the lessons learned Montgomery County did was basically a rough proportionality calculation to sort of say, this is what we think the answer should be. Are we overburdening the private sector? So that, the link that Christine just sent out will take you to like a 3-page summary, and it's got links to the other stuff. There's a bullet point, a couple lines about the rough proportionality test in Montgomery County. And then in terms of freight, the recommended practice guidance on freight really is like so much other good guidance, context sensitive, so that, in general, it's still, on a quantitative perspective, for most cases, it's still the heavy vehicle, kind of impact that trucks account for more than just a car when you're doing a motorized vehicle analysis. But it's more about the on-site stuff, and particularly now the idea that it's just not loading zones for commercial properties, but multifamily residential properties now with e-commerce, need to have good access and circulation for deliveries, which is, in some jurisdictions, absolutely part of this MTIA. What's the site look like? In other jurisdictions, that's more like, that's for the site planners to figure out. It's not really something that an MTIA does. But if you're doing something where you have a significant, and that's a bloated word, amount of trucks, if you're doing a distribution center, well, then you really need to think of trucks as a separate mode and go to the best data you can get, which is often from the applicant, in terms of what is your distribution pattern, who are you serving with this distribution center, and but it's a judgment call for jurisdictions as to when do I have something that really is a freight intensive development that I need to do that separate TIA analysis as a separate mode.
Great, thanks, Dan. Back to you, Christine, to pepper the panel with more questions.
Sure. And folks, if you do have any other questions, just type them in the Q&A box. We'll see what we can get to. Let's start down here with you, Philip. Can you talk more about how the vehicle miles travel mitigation fee works with other site associated improvements, such as installation of a traffic signal or general transportation impact fees that the city may require?
Yeah, so for improvements for VMT, they're usually end user facilities. So you could ask for bike racks, bike lockers, bike showers. Those are some of the improvements, and then we could also condition them to construct a bike lane with signage and striping. So that's for bike improvements, and then for pedestrian improvements, it could be a sidewalk, a crosswalk, ADA ramps, audible ped push buttons. Those are some of the improvements that we've asked for in the past. The wooden learn example, they utilized transit bus subsidy passes, and it was over 10 years. They're going to provide their residents with $50,000 worth of bus passes, so it'll encourage you to use buses instead of your vehicles. Other things are unbundling parking costs, so that would stop a development from building a lot of parking spaces and discourage the use of vehicles. The other thing is increased land use and density. So it allows you to build more units on site, and we have a density bonus for that. So those are all of the improvements that a developer can do. And then another item, if I remember correctly, is affordable housing. So it's a portion of the cost of a market rate housing as a VMT reduction tool. So those are some of the improvements that we've been implementing so far.
And to that, tagging on another related question, projects that are required to mitigate the vehicle miles traveled, is there a target reduction?
Correct. So OPR, which is the Office of Planning and Research, that was their original name, but they changed their name to Land Use and Innovation. In California, they released a document that recommended agencies to mitigate 15% below existing. And that was the baseline condition. That was their recommendation. It was up to the agency to adopt that recommendation. So in 2020, when we transitioned to use VMT, we did adopt that recommendation. The project had to mitigate 15% below its existing VMT baseline. What we've come across is that was increasingly difficult to meet that. You're not just going to stay at your current VMT level, you're going to go 15% below. So we were asking a lot of developers to meet that baseline or that improved condition, which is very difficult. When and I didn't include this in my presentation, when we adopted our VMT mitigation bank, we moved that baseline condition to just existing. So in theory, we gave a 15% baseline improvement right off the bat. We were trying to be business friendly and have a lot of development come to our city since we're still developing. So today, and this is what we adopted in December 2024, and we have our new traffic impact study guidelines. The existing condition is just to keep it at the baseline condition, not to have any impact. So that's our baseline for today.
Thank you. Melissa, let's jump over to you for a couple of questions here. Melissa, how did you determine the most likely path of travel to transit? Was there a specific software or methodology that was used to determine the origin and destination?
So the origin and destination are just the nearest transit stops to the development, and then the path of travel would come from probably Google Maps with like if you're a pedestrian, it's whatever the nearest, most likely safe path of travel. We wouldn't really take into account jaywalking or probably what most people are going to take as a general rule of thumb.
Okay. Another question for you, since we have you here. Did the city revise their codes and ordinances to codify the TIA study process? How do the requirements for development approval, are they tied to the project's potential multimodal impact?
Yes. So we updated the code to codify the manual or the guideline. And in the code, we added language. I forget exactly what it says, but it's about they have to do their study and determine the mitigation measures before they submit to Planning Commission or to the building permit if they're straight zoned.
This question here, let me get up here. Will the 12th edition of the IT manual include updates to help guide the traffic impact study approach rather than the TIA approach? Also, when is the anticipated time frame for this update to the 12th edition?
Yeah, I can jump in and handle
Please.
that one. Yeah, because I think that part of it is that what I've been talking about has been a recommended practice for how to do the TIAs, and frankly, the goal of this recommended practice is to cover all the jurisdictions. So if you're only caring about cars because you're in a rural jurisdiction, it still works for you. But it's got these processes and ideas to become more multimodal. So that's kind of one element of what that recommended practice is. 11th, 12th edition, ITE is in the process of taking the trip generation manual, which is just basically the database of how many trips do different uses generate. That should be released this summer. I know the goal is to unveil it at the annual meeting in August. And actually, we're starting to think about what would the 13th edition be. Kind of again, that will help you to some extent. Each of the last 2 or 3 editions of that manual of data has had more about freight trips, for instance. What's the freight trip generation, and again, an evolution from just vehicle trips to person trips where that's available, and then starting to think more about the land use context. So there was a question about TNDs. We now have a lot more data that in certain contexts you have different trip generation patterns. So that's that all will continue to evolve.
Thank you. It looks like we have one more question here in our little question bank. Wondering if the cities are considering traditional neighborhood development designs where people have the ability to walk, bike, and roll to their everyday needs. It seems the suburban development patterns are very auto-centric, leading to more and more vehicle miles traveled. Thoughts?
I guess it's Brad. One of the things, I guess my conclusion with T&D is it depends on the context or setting, because I've seen a lot of T&Ds that are very remote and people drive from the T&Ds to work and to grocery stores and other things. So it really depends on the context of the T&D and the trip making characteristics, if transit serves the T&D or if it's very remote and only has paratransit. So I think T&D and design and land use really depend on the location and context. If you have T&D in the right setting, you can greatly reduce auto trips. If it's very remote, it's in remote South Carolina and you got to drive to Beaufort or Bluffton or something, then it's not really reducing VMT. It might actually be increasing VMT. It might be a beautiful development, but it actually increases VMT.
I have a quick comment on that one. One of the goals for VMT reduction is infill development. So instead of going out to a suburban field to construct your single family homes, infill development within the city. So it'll reduce your trip distance and provide alternate trip modes for a development. So that's one comment I'll say. And the other trend that we're seeing is there's no more big box retail. The idea of a mall is not alive anymore. There's this term I saw, it's called malls to mixed use development. So that's what it's being constructed now. Sometimes you have a retail store at the bottom and then you have residential on top. And so that kind of reduces a trip to the store, right? That's the trend that we're seeing out here. And then houses aren't being built horizontally anymore. They're being built vertically. So there's a lot of zone changes and specific plan changes. We're going from 30 single family homes into now 60 multifamily residences on the same lot. So there's a vertical component now that's trending, and some of them are even in areas where it's rural. So you'll have a very flat 1 or 2 level home, and right next to it there's a 3 or 4 story multifamily home development. So that's what we've been seeing as the trend to reduce VMT. So wanted to share that.
And I'll just jump into from like TOD to TND. I think there's a little bit of a cultural shift there. And I just had the occasion to be doing some research recently and seeing a study, I'm not going to say where 25 years ago they said there's this great development in a suburban area. We're going to get 25% of the people on transit. I think it got approved. And then they basically never got built. They came back and started doing it again about a year ago and said, good development. We're going to get 25 people to walk and bike from one use within the center to the other. So, like the same exact numbers, we can still use those numbers, but it's now not those people on transit, it's the people walking and biking because all the uses are together. So again, that's not a great example to use as this is how the work should be done, but it is kind of that evolution to, you don't need to have transit everywhere to reduce VMT.
Melissa, do you have any other parting comments from your end?
Yeah, I guess on that same topic, we also try to coordinate a lot with our transit planners and engineers. They're always trying to expand the network as well, so they're looped in with the development reviews that go through Planning Commission, and so we try to include them with our studies in their review. We make sure the traffic engineers are coordinating with them directly in case there aren't posted plans for future transit, but if there are future transit plans, then we'll have that in our studies and they'll know that transit would be coming to the area. But yeah, we have lots of transportation plans, both from planning department and our Department of Transportation, to expand networks, fill sidewalk gaps, and those kinds of things. So trying to do our best to get to those developments that aren't directly in a very urban core.
All right. Well, I think that's going to wrap us up here. Thanks to all those attending and to our panelists today. This was a great conversation. And of course, to our sponsors, the Private Practice Division and Transportation Planning Division, thank you for bringing this session to us. We appreciate you. Folks, don't forget to log those CM credits, and this recording will be available early next week up on our YouTube channel, so be sure to take a look. Don't forget to register for all of our upcoming sessions, and everyone have a great rest of your week, and we'll talk next time. Thank you.
Thank you.